Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down my fight against Benjamin Aycrigg at Clash for the Cash. And specifically I want to go over one of the really unique ways that Ben likes to fight. So if you didn't know, Ben is an extremely high level fencer who uses a lot of offline footwork. Now I have previously made some videos and comments about offline footwork in general, so I wanted to really go over this fight, which I do end up losing, and go over not just how I lost, but specifically how Ben's offline footwork might have contributed to that loss. I want to go over this specifically because a lot of people, when they talk about offline footwork, don't really talk about it in the context of HEMA for the most part. They usually talk about it in the context of boxing or MMA, and they just sort of assume that that same kind of footwork and same kind of application just will convert over one-to-one, and of course it doesn't. But at the same time, normally when I talk about offline footwork, I talk about offline footwork once you're already close to somebody. But Ben does it from distance. So we're going to take a look at, especially these first couple exchanges, to really see how that offline footwork maybe did or did not play into the exchange's payoff. So looking at this first exchange, there is a whole lot of offline footwork to look at. But the question is, what does it really accomplish and what does it have to do with the end result? So as you watch this exchange go on, what you're basically seeing is Benjamin is doing a whole lot of lateral stepping. He is basically going from 90 degrees to my right to all the way 90 degrees to my left, covering a 180 degree area. And at the exact same time as this is happening, I'm just making tiny little adjustments to try to track him with my sword and with the front of my body. And obviously, if you're ever trying to track someone who's moving around a lot on the outside of distance, it's a hell of a lot easier to simply adjust your feet and the angle of your body and just keep track of them than it is to do the lateral footwork on the outside of the orbit. They're going to have to travel way more distance, do way more motion, and expend way more energy. So on the offset, on the start here, it doesn't seem like it's really accomplishing much of anything. But all of that kind of changes once Ben decides to finally attack. Now what you see here at the end is essentially what happens is Ben comes in, throws a kind of entry attack. It's a little bit of a Zverkow, it's a little bit of a Shielhao. I parry it, but then at which point I am starting to back up and I am looking for a counterattack at the exact same time. I recognize that Ben is not going to try to parry an afterblow. He is instead going to reassert the exact same line on his right side, my left side, and just kind of come in over the top and get one onto my head. And it's a really nice, clean exchange. But the question is, what did offline footwork have to do with this? Now, the obvious answer is right before Ben attacked, he shuffled all the way over towards my left side, his right side, and that is the exact same angle that he attacked on. Now, logically, it makes sense that the more you move over to one side, the more you're likely to have a kind of dominant angle on the side that you just moved to. Because, of course, nobody responds instantly, including myself, and there's always the possibility that if you shuffle over to your right, the other person might not have adjusted quickly enough before you have started to attack, thus you have a pretty nice line. But I don't really necessarily think that's what happened here. When you watch the approach that Ben takes, I've really perfectly adjusted to this angle. There's no point at which I am really vulnerable to that side, and because I'm facing him, it really just comes at me like a single side attack. However, there is another element here, and that is the position of the feet. Now, we have to kind of work around the fact that a line judge was playing Get Down, Mr. President, and just leaping in front of my camera at every opportunity. But the basic thing here that you can mostly see is that when Benjamin's right foot ends up forward, it's on the outside of my left foot. Now, as you might remember, I fence with my left foot forward, which means that if Ben's right foot, his lead leg at the time of the attack, is outside of my lead foot, my left foot, that means he does necessarily have an outside angle. And this is an angle that actually means a lot in the world of boxing and MMA because it basically tells you that Ben's right shoulder is going to be on the outside line of my left shoulder. And what that means is that when both of us throw attacks with our weapons, they both have to come from the level of our shoulders. I'm right-handed, which means that it has to come from the level of my right shoulder. So not only is Ben on the outside line of my lead leg and my lead shoulder, he's behind my lead leg and my lead shoulder in terms of how he can be attacked by my dominant side, the side that I'm inevitably going to throw an attack from, even if I have to parry first. So the irony here is that while it doesn't seem like from the foot position that we start with, Ben had a dominant angle, he uses his offline footwork to kind of put himself in a position where he might get a good angle, but then he also uses offline footwork as he steps in to make sure he can make a kind of nice angle into a really nice angle. And more importantly, after that, it also showcases why Ben simply attacked 2 times in a row rather than throwing an attack, seeing that he got parried, and then waiting to block a follow-up shot, because he knew, based on the angle that he was on, that I was significantly less likely to be able to throw an effective counterattack, even though I had parried, because of the angle that he had approached at. Now, this next exchange is not a very exciting one, and it doesn't involve any offline footwork, but it does get you into my headspace during the fight. By the way, I'm on the right, Ben's on the left. Hopefully at this point you can recognize me, but I mean, I'm just probably not that famous. But what I'm trying to do in this particular exchange is I'm trying to do a stepping parry. And the reason I'm trying to do a stepping parry is because my understanding of Ben's fighting style so far is that he has this offline aggression. And therefore, I think that if I go in straight, right when I think he's about to start moving offline, I'm going to catch him as he's shuffling his feet. I'm going to be the one who gets the dominant offside line. And chances are, if I step with a parry, I'm going to parry the first instinctive shot that he throws. And I do, in a way. This does mostly work out. I do start moving forward the second I see Ben start to move off the side. I do have a pretty okay angle as soon as I start to move. I do get the parry with my step. The only problem is that Ben is athletic enough and fast enough to start immediately backing up straight away from me rather than finishing his offline footwork, and creates enough distance that as I throw my follow-up shot from my stepping parry, he just hits me in the hands. Again, not a particularly exciting exchange, but it does show you one of the known weaknesses of offline footwork, which is that it's really big, it's really easy to time, and it can use up a lot of space that doesn't actually move you away from the engagement. Clearly, Ben is aware of this shortcoming, which is why he has developed such an effective ability to pivot from moving to his side to moving straight forward or straight backwards. Now, I've skipped an exchange because it wasn't particularly interesting, but this next one is interesting because I make my first adjustment to the kinds of footwork that I was seeing from Ben here, and that is I switch from my left foot forward to my right foot forward. Now, in the past when I've talked about this, what I basically said is that a left foot forward allows you to use a passing step for all of your aggression while not really taking too much away from your defense, whereas a right foot forward takes away a lot of your ability to explode forward with a big, long passing step, but quickens your footwork to the point where you can often parry riposte a little bit faster and maybe get that point out a little bit faster. The reason I switched to my right foot forward here is because, one, I want to be more linear. And in my opinion, one of the best ways to try to counteract someone who's effectively using their offline footwork over and over again is to simply interrupt it with very, very linear footwork. So the idea here is that by switching to my right foot forward, what I'm essentially looking to do is get single time thrusts, single time cuts that just have either a simple step or a big lunge directly into measure and just hitting my target. And the idea here is that if I can catch Ben as he's moving to his left or to his right, he's going to be square against me. He's not going to be able to effectively change direction going forward or backward. And as long as I get the timing right, really precisely right, I'm also going to practically force him to become a more linear fencer himself, because he's going to recognize that I'm going to try to explode at him, and he's going to counteract by exploding at me in turn. And that's really what happens in this exchange. I switch to my right foot forward, I'm loading up with my back foot, and I am just waiting for that opportunity to strike. Ben, recognizing that I am now doing something completely different, starts to fence a little bit more linearly, and now that we are both right foot to right foot, we are in a much more traditional fighting standoff here, where offline footwork might not get him the exact same angles as he had before. So he decides to go straight in, I parry, I riposte with a zwerk, and it does manage to kind of work out for me. Ben throws a follow-up zwerk of his own. It was a little bit close, it might have been a little bit flat, but what really matters here is the stark difference between this parried riposte that I got off on this exchange and the parry riposte that I tried to go for in the first exchange. You can see here how the offline footwork really played a role, because now that this time Ben didn't have a dominant offline side, he couldn't afford to simply charge in, get parried, and then throw a follow-up attack without realizing that he was going to be hit back in return. Whereas before, when this exact same scenario happened, my parry didn't turn into an adequate riposte because of the angle that the offline footwork that Ben used got him into. So, if you're looking to try to use some offline footwork, this is a really good case where you can see both the pros and the cons, and both a good setup and a setup that didn't quite work. Now, our next exchange is another short one, and another one that doesn't involve any offline footwork, but the fact that it doesn't involve any offline footwork is very indicative of the payoff. In this particular exchange, I catch Ben using a reflexive shot towards my hands as soon as I walk into range, at which point I time it and simply thrust him in the neck. Now, the judges ruled this double deep, and it doesn't really matter, but what really matters here is the idea that every single time so far that Ben has utilized his offline footwork, he has gotten the better of me in the exchange. However, every single time that I have forced him to not use his offline footwork, I have gotten either a neutral exchange or the better of an exchange. And this again tells you one of the real push and pull aspects of offline footwork, especially as it pertains to offline footwork before you are actually in engagement range. The key aspect that dictates whether or not you're able to use this kind of offline footwork in a lot of ways comes down to the pace of your opponent. As I've said before, I am a very defensive fighter, and I'm trying to do my best here to be aggressive. And the reason I'm trying to be aggressive is because in a lot of ways, the only way I can shut down the circling footwork that my opponent is using here is by making sure that he just doesn't have the time or space to do it. So if you're fencing someone who uses a lot of offline footwork, especially before they have started their engagement, that is one of the most obvious counters that you can use. However, as is happening here, it might not be the kind of style of fencing that you're particularly used to. I am not used to being aggressive, especially in the openings of the fight. I'm not used to being the one who comes in with the attack first, and it's starting to really show. It's also showing that Ben is very used to people who try to use this aggression to try to force them to stop using his offline footwork, and he has a game plan set in place for this exact scenario. So I skipped another exchange, and this is the last exchange, and reviewing the footage, it doesn't necessarily seem like I did as badly as I probably did in the score, but what this exchange really reflects is how badly it felt to actually be in the fight at the time, because in my mind, this is what every single exchange actually felt like. It felt like I had no real ability to dictate the pace of the fight, because if Ben started getting revved up and started using his offline footwork, I was completely scared stiff of the initial attack, and I had no confidence in my parry riposts. So to compensate, I started trying to be more aggressive, which I'm just not very good at. And as you can see in this exchange, we see a very clear indication that I am just not an aggressive fencer. I am looking at Ben moving left and right. He's getting these angles. I don't want him to get. And so I try to time that offline footwork again, and I miss the timing. I end up throwing a shield how flat directly at someone who is not in range and is not moving side to side, and I get easily parried. And at this point, my brain is telling me that I'm about to get hit. And I wasn't wrong. Immediately after missing the shield how, I managed to just barely parry a stab. But what you're going to notice here is that when I parry this incoming attack, I don't actually respond off of it. I have been forced into a defensive mindset despite the fact that I am the one moving forward. And this again shows you just how much the setup and payoff of offline footwork, again, in the pre-fencing, in the range in which you're not able to engage someone, can really mess with somebody's brain. Now, at the exact same time, I will point out that the offline footwork as a setup didn't really do anything to change the angle of our engagement, but what it definitely did was change the engagement from my own mental perspective. So one of the aspects of offline footwork that I often tell people is that it can be a little bit gimmicky. It can be, in a lot of ways, a thing that gets into your opponent's head or just flat out doesn't, because the applications of offline footwork from this distance are pretty limited. But if you can get it in your opponent's head that these applications are there, well, they might start responding to something that they don't necessarily have to. And that's exactly what we see here by me. I am responding to something, trying to cut off this offline footwork with everything I possibly can, only to recognize that when I do finally accomplish my goal, that it just didn't really matter. Ben is just as capable of fencing in a linear fashion as anybody else, and as a very high-level fencer, he is more than good enough at distance management to capitalize on my seemingly badly timed shield house. So I throw the shield how, I get parried, I get riposted, and then I just start flailing my sword back and forth because I'm completely panicking, and eventually one of Ben's attacks while moving backwards gets through for another clean set of points. So if you are looking to use offline footwork in your own fencing, recognize the pros and cons here. The pros being that if your opponent is slow to adjust, you can theoretically get a very good dominant angle on your attack. However, recognize that getting that dominant angle is going to be rare. And most of what you have to actually look for is use your offline footwork to try to game and utilize a kind of like provocation on your opponent so as to get them to try to make an adjustment to something that frankly isn't always all that impactful. Also, similarly, pay a very close attention to what foot your opponent has forward, because once again, every single time I had my left leg forward, Ben was probably circling to my left because he wanted to get on the outside of my lead leg, and the few times that I had my right leg forward, well, he started circling to my right because he wanted to get on the outside of my lead leg. That is going to be your general game plan if you want to use this offline footwork. So, in summation, if you want to fight like Ben, here's how you do it. If you want to try to beat Ben, well, I don't know. But if you want to see more breakdowns like this, I'm going to have more videos next week.